it sure is nice to see everybody, and appreciate y'all coming out on a rainy night to learn about the Cherokee War of 1776. Now, I do want to start tonight, the program tonight, with a 7-minute video that I think you're going to enjoy. So, here we go.
These swamps and pastures, forests and hills. The shot heard round the world rang out in the north as a rallying cry for American independence. In the southern colonies, however, it served only to amplify the growing discord between American patriots and British loyalists. Pledge allegiance to a king sitting far across the Atlantic, taxing fruits born from Carolinian soil, or stand up to the crown with an inferior army? As stalemate gripped the war in the north, the high command began to eye the southern colonies, which were thought to harbor sympathy for the crown, that the British believed could be leveraged into a loyalist army. Twice the British tried to capture the port of Charlestown, the gateway to the south. Finally, they were successful in May of 1780. With the southern branch of the Continental Army in retreat, the British now had the foothold in the south to tip the balance of the war in their favor, and in time, snuff out the colonial uprising. But they underestimated the tenacity of Carolinians. Partisan militias had sprung up throughout the state, and experienced as they were, these men believed this land to be their own and were unshakable in their pursuit for liberty. Americans saw desperate and gruesome fighting. They were nearly destroyed at Waxhaws and Camden, but into this Carolina soil they dug their heels, rising time and again to harass the British, and finally prevailing over loyalist and provincial forces at Musgrove's Mill and Kings Mountain. Word began to spread. A small band of patriots was defying the Crown's efforts to seize the southern colonies. Soon the Continental Army, along with the militia, achieved a cunning victory at Cowpens, setting into motion a string of events that saw the British split in two. One element surrendered at Yorktown, and the other eventually retreated to Charlestown, where they remained till war's end, bottled up by the very patriots they hoped to suppress. With over 200 battles and skirmishes fought within the state's borders, South Carolinians felt the full force of civil and global war. From 1780 to 1782 alone, more than 1,000 South Carolinians laid down their lives on America's road to liberty. But what remains of those intrepid days? Victory lies dormant, buried, and the hallowed grounds where the blood of those brave Carolinians was shed sits neglected and overgrown. The American Battlefield Trust has partnered with the South Carolina Battleground Trust to preserve these battlefields and unify them with the creation of the Liberty Trail. Sweeping across the state, the Liberty Trail is an innovative driving tour that will fully convey South Carolina's Revolutionary War story, bring tourism and economic development to local communities, and invite a larger audience to appreciate the state's contribution to American independence. The trail will feature brand new battlefield parks at Utah Springs, Camden, Waxhaws, Hanging Rock, and Fort Fairlawn, and make significant additions and improvements to existing parks. Each stop along the driving tour will feature unique on-site interpretations that will connect visitors to the extraordinary events that came to pass nearly 250 years ago. The Liberty Trail will honor the patriots that decided the Revolution's outcome in the swamps, fields, woods, and mountains of South Carolina. Those Carolinians blazed the trail to liberty, and all we've got to do is cut back the brush, clear off the path, and bring to light South Carolina's pivotal story in the American Revolution. Will you stand by as these battlefields slip further into obscurity? Or will you help us preserve these hallowed grounds and blaze the Liberty Trail?
That's what it's all about, folks. That's why we're here. Lawrence County is chock full of historic sites, and half of these sites are lost. Now, we can recover lost history and interpret Lawrence County's story for the nation. We're talking about the South Carolina Battlefield Trust creating that video there. Well, the role of South Carolina and Lawrence County is going to be advertised statewide, nationally, internationally. We're going to be bringing in tourists like you've never seen before. You folks are tourists. I know you're a Revolutionary War tourist. You go to these sites. There are many, many people out there just like you going to these sites. So I hope that you will join me, and I really appreciate the support that I get from everyone. But there are site after site here in Lawrence County that we need to recover. And we are so fortunate that we have recovered many of these sites. And one of those sites in particular that we have recovered is Fort Lindley. And at this point, I'd like for Roy to raise his hand. This is Roy Christie, folks. Roy rediscovered Fort Lindley in 1970s. He saw a little map that had an old fort shown on the map. He spent 2 years looking for that old fort, and he found it 5 miles from his house. And so Fort Lindley is one of the sites here in Lawrence County, and we've got a field trip going to Fort Lindley on Saturday. And if it wasn't for Roy, we wouldn't be having this field trip because he's the one that found this fort. And we are eternally grateful to you for that, Roy. Well, tonight we're going to be talking about the Cherokee War of 1776. And several people asked me about the books that I used, for my lectures and where did I, learn about this, that, and the other. And one thing I'd like to point out to you is just of the different books you read, you're going to get a different story in every book. And I've gotten so many different, stories about the different events that happened. And I try to explain to you all the different stories and versions that I've heard. And you can decide for yourself which story you like the best or believe in. The story I always believe in is the story that I heard first. So I don't know what that says about human nature. But anyway, one of the books I would like to point out is a book by a relatively local author who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. But Jerry Alexander wrote, Blood Red Runs the Sacred Kiowee. Now this is a very local author. over 90% of the events that he describes in this book happened within 30 or 40 miles of where we are right now. And Jerry is he was a retired newspaperman. He wrote several books, and he was an illustrator. And the pictures in this book were done by Jerry, so you'll enjoy this book. Another book that is particularly germane to tonight's topic is a book by Jim Peacock. He's a very well-respected author who is a professor at Kennesaw College in Georgia, I believe. But the title of this book is Three Peoples, One King. And this book describes the Native American experiences during the Revolutionary War, the African American experiences, and the Loyalist experiences. Those three people, Loyalist, African Americans had mixed reaction to what was going on in the Revolutionary War. But three peoples who were in opposition to the Patriot forces. And another book that's excellent, particularly as far as the Cherokee War of 1776 is concerned, is Nadia Dean's book, A Demand of Blood. This book, she is a great author. She is a great scholar. She researched her material more so than many of the other authors I have ever read. The main character in her book here is a leading man of the Cherokees named Dragging Canoe. Dragging Canoe was the war chief, if you will, of the Cherokees. He led the raids against the settlers. Now, is Dragging Canoe a freedom fighter? He could be. Dragging Canoe also committed some of the most gruesome and grotesque tortures on his captives that you can imagine. And Nadia Dean doesn't shy away from that. But this is sort of the Revolutionary War from the Native Americans' point of view. So, and she has great stuff in there. I learned several things from reading this book that I had not known before. So I did want to point out those books and where some of the information that I talk about, where it comes from. So before we begin talking about the Cherokees' role in the Revolutionary War, which was very significant, particularly in the backcountry. I do want to talk about an event that was occurring at the same time that the Cherokee War of 1776 was occurring. And these events are related. What I'm talking about is the Battle of Sullivans Island, which occurred on June 28, 1776. Now, there was a lot of talk about the British wanting to have a two-front attack on the southern colonies on South Carolina by having the Native Americans in the mountains and so forth on the western side attack at the same time that the British were attacking the coast of South Carolina and North Carolina. So these events are related in that regard. Now, there is some question about whether the British forces actually were fomenting a two-pronged attack. There is no doubt that a Shawnee delegation came down and talked with the Cherokee chiefs before the Cherokees went on the warpath, and believe me, they went on the warpath. So we know that the Shawnees wanted to coordinate a two-pronged attack. John Stewart was the superintendent of Indian Affairs for the British colony, and he was headquarters in Charleston at 106 Tradd Street, and that house is still standing. He was the superintendent of Indian Affairs when the governor of South Carolina, William Campbell, got run out of town, had to go to a warship in Charleston Harbor. John Stewart realized then that his safety was in danger. So he left and he went to Pensacola, Florida, and that's where he operated for the remainder of the war. But his wife and children stayed behind, and they basically stayed behind in Charleston as hostages to make sure that John Stuart behaved himself. And John Stuart did not want the Cherokees to go to war because he knew what was going to happen to them. He was a wise man. And there was a letter that circulated about this time from John Stuart that many people feel was a forgery, with John Stuart talking about how he wanted to, start a Cherokee uprising and so forth to take care of the Patriots. But Nadia Dean in particular, claims that that letter is a forgery, and it probably was. Second in command to John Stuart with the Indian Affairs Department was Alexander Cameron. And Alexander Cameron lived right here in the back country. He lived in Abbeville County. He had a plantation there called Lochaber. And he had a Cherokee wife and several children. He was very well respected and received by the Cherokees. Not too far from where Alexander Cameron lived was another plantation owned by Andrew Williamson. And Andrew Williamson's plantation was in Greenwood County on Whitehall Road, where Whitehall Road crosses Highway 221 at Hard Labor Creek. We don't exactly know where that home was, but that was the area. So Andrew Williamson and Alexander Cameron lived maybe 20 miles from each other. So they would have known each other. They did know each other, and they hated each other. And Andrew Williamson hated Alexander Cameron, and he sent an assassination squad after him. But the word was that Cameron was the one who was fomenting all the Cherokee uprising. Others say it was just coincidental that the Cherokees were attacking at the same time that the British Navy and their armada showed up opposite Charleston with the Battle of Sullivans Island. So I'm pretty sure most of y'all are familiar with the geography of Charleston Harbor and so forth. That's where the Ashley and the Cooper River joined together to form the Atlantic Ocean. If you're not from South Carolina, you didn't know that, but we all know it for sure. This is Sullivans Island here. And this is, we call it the Isle of Palms today. Back then it was called Long Island. And there was a fort, a three-sided fort, but on the tip of Sullivans Island. And this fort was built by William Moultrie. And this is the famous Palmetto Log Fort that the state of South Carolina, our state tree that Palmetto is named after. One thing I didn't realize, the fort was double walled, and these walls were 16 feet apart, and the interior of those walls were filled with sand. And you tell me a cannonball is going to go through that palmetto log and through that sand and so forth. So that was a fairly secure fort, except that it was unfinished. It was just three-sided at the time. So in June of 1776, the British Armada, which is here, floated across the bar at the entrance to Charleston Harbor. And they had a total of 385 cannons, big ones too. They had a bomb ketch, Thunder. It was, shooting mortars over into the fort. There were 32 cannons in Fort Moultrie, as it was later called, against the 385 that the British ships had. The British flagship was the Bristol, mounting 50 guns. The Experiment mounted 50 guns. So they started blasting away, but they soon realized that they weren't making any headway against that Palmetto Log Fort. In the meantime, those 32 cannons in the fort with mismatched munitions, 9-pounders from France, 12-pounders, 18, 26-pounders. They were all different sizes and everything. And they were under the command of Francis Marion. Now, I have no idea where Francis Marion learned how to shoot a cannon. His experience fighting was in the French and Indian War, 1755 to 1762. And he fought with the Indians, and he knew the Indian style, and that's where he learned his guerrilla warfare tactics. But there's no record of him ever shooting a cannon before or since the Battle of Fort Moultrie. So Francis Marion, with this 32 mismatched cannons, they are blasting the dickens out of that British fleet. Now, I've heard one fellow say that the British fleet were so, they anchored. They were so dismissive of, that little sandy fort on Sullivans Island. But what they did try to do was they tried to send three ships with shallow drafts around to the back side of Fort Moultrie. And as they did that, fortunately, those three ships all ran into an exposed or unexposed or hidden sandbar. And two of the ships latched in like this, and rigging was tangled, and they couldn't move. And the third ship, the Actaeon, it was stuck fast in the sandbar. Well, the tide rose, and those two ships were able to straighten up, and they sailed away, but the Actaeon stayed behind, and the British set it on fire and burned it to the hull. But the British ships were blasted so strongly that one of those cannonballs hit the Bristol, where Sir Peter Parker, the admiral, was directing the fight, and standing beside him was William Campbell, who was the deposed British governor of South Carolina. Well, when that cannonball hit, William Campbell was killed immediately. And a splinter about that long hit Peter Parker right in the rear end. And he was out of that battle for the rest. So that was a glorious victory. Also, while this is going on, General Clinton landed 3,000 men on Long Island. Long Island was undefended. But the Patriot forces had a force of 750 men on the north shore of Sullivans Island, right at Breach Inlet. Now, you folks who've been on vacation in there, this is Breach Inlet between Sullivans Island and Isle of Palms. It is where the Lindley was launched in the Civil War. And if you've been around Breach Inlet, you know there are riptides through Breach Inlet. And Breach Inlet's no fun place to go swimming. You can't go swimming. It's illegal right there. The riptides are so bad. The British didn't know that. They had information that the water was 18 inches deep, which it is close to Isle of Palms, but the closer you get to Sullivan's Island, the deeper it gets, and it was 7 feet tall with a strong riptide going through there. So Clinton and his 3,000 men were stymied right there. And they were stymied by the commander of the 750 men, which was William Danger Thompson. Now, those of you who heard last month's lecture know about William Danger Thompson. He was the leader of the 1,300-man strike force that surrounded Patrick Cunningham at the Battle of the Great Canebrake. And those of you who went to that field trip know exactly what we're talking about. So William Danger Thompson in December of 1775 is right up here. He's camped at Hollingsworth Mill, right on Raven Creek, goes up to the Canebrake, captures Patrick Cunningham, a loyalist who also lived here in Lawrence County, by the way. Now, 6 months later, he's at Sullivan's Island fending off 3,000 of Cornwallis's or Clinton's troops. So that is the Battle of Sullivan's Island. June 28th, 1776. Now, I say a lot of dates, and I don't care if you remember or not, but there's two dates I really want you to remember. One of them is Carolina Day, June 28th, 1776. Carolina Day is a very important date in South Carolina history. The other date is May the 12th, 1780, and that's the time that Charleston fell. And when Charleston fell, it was an absolute calamity in South Carolina. For 3 months, that's when the yoke of British oppression was snuffing out freedom in South Carolina. There weren't any British before then, mainly because we blasted the dickens out of them at the Battle of Sullivans Island. As many important battles as they were in South Carolina, this has got to rank right up there at the top of the list, because when you see what did happen when Charleston fell, it was 4 years before the British were able to take Charleston again, and that time they did it by land rather than by sea. So this battle bought South Carolina 4 years. This is the inside of Fort Moultrie, and you can see the flag that he flew, indigo blue flag with a silver crescent. It's not a moon, it's not a gorget, it's a crescent. That's what Moultrie says. Silver crescent on a blue field is how he describes his. And we know that this flag was dyed with indigo, so it would have been indigo blue. This flagstaff was shot in half, and so the British thought that the fort had surrendered when that happened, till Sergeant Jasper took a ramrod and tied the flag to the ramrod, stood on the parapet there and started waving it back and forth. So, you know, we revere Sergeant Jasper for his actions there. Unfortunately, he was killed at the Battle of Savannah. So, y'all remember that date, Carolina Day. It's an important day for us. So now I want to talk about the Cherokee War of 1776. And this was not a pretty time. It was a lot of slaughtering, a lot of evilness was going on during this time. The picture here is of the leading Cherokee man. His name is Oconostota. He was a very wise man. He was a brave warrior in the First Cherokee War, or the Anglo-Cherokee War. He was a leader there in 1762. He was noted for his wisdom. He did not want to go to war, usually, but when he did go to war, he was a, great warrior. Another leading man of the Cherokees was a little short fella named Attakulla, and he was referred to as Little Carpenter. Attakulla was a peacemaker. He was given the name of Little Carpenter because from very disparate elements he could build together a peace treaty. And he was instrumental in the Treaty of Charlestown in 1763 and other treaties as well. If there's ever a royal family in the Cherokee Nation, it would have been Attakulla's family. And this is sort of an unusual thing, but his son was also a leading Cherokee man. And his son was named Dragging Canoe. And Dragging Canoe was the war chief of the Cherokees. Dragging Canoe got his name from when he was a young boy, not barely reaching manhood, and the braves and the warriors in his village or town wanted to go on a raid. And Dragging Canoe piped up and said, "Well, I want to go with you." And they turned around and looked at him and they started laughing. He said, you ain't going with us. You can't go with us until you can carry your own canoe. So the time came for the raiders to leave, and they looked down the path, and all of a sudden, here comes this little boy dragging a canoe behind him. And that's how Dragging Canoe got his name. Now, Dragging Canoe instituted some horrible tortures on his enemies. Brutal, indescribable. And as it turned out, any massacre that the Cherokees, created, he got blamed for it, whether he was there or not. So, at this time, I kind of want to talk about my own personal feelings about, the conflicts between the Native Americans and the European Americans. Truly, these were two cultures that did not understand each other. The relation with the Native Americans started off very wrong, and it ended very wrong. And in the middle, there was about a 120-year period where it was nothing but retribution and reprisal for what had just gone on before. When the first contact, Native American contact with European Americans is in 1524 when Hernando de Ayllon sailed into Winyah Bay, which is where Georgetown is. And he promptly captured 60 Winyah Indians, took them into slavery in the Caribbean. So that was the Native Americans' introduction to European culture. At the same time, diseases were rampant among the Native Americans. They had no defenses. It's estimated that there were 10 million Native Americans at first contact. By the time of the Revolutionary War, there were 1 million Native Americans. That's 90% of the Native American population died before the Revolutionary War occurred. But then again, and there were great relations with the Cherokees from about the 1730s to 1755. They signed the Treaty of Saluda. That was the treaty that gave 8 counties right here. It was, the British colonial government bought this land from the Cherokees. Everybody was happy with that. The sale price was 1,000 pounds of lead, or powder rather, and 2,000 pounds of lead every fall for the fall hunt. And everybody was happy with that arrangement. But the pressures, kept increasing and increasing and increasing. And there was that terrible misunderstanding that happened during the Anglo-Cherokee War, end of the French and Indian War, where the Cherokees that originally were British allies helped take Fort Duquesne with Richard Paris. But on the way back, there was a terrible misunderstanding on stolen horses. 22 North Carolinians were killed in the process of somewhat retrieving those horses, which weren't the horses that were stolen. Terrible misunderstandings. And that was the first Cherokee War. And that war ended with General James Grant of the British government going through and just utterly destroying the lower town Cherokee villages. So there was a period of relative peace, but there was always tension going on. And in 1766, right here on the banks of the NRE River, now this is between the wars, when there was a relative peace, but this is the kind of things that were happening. The wife of Benjamin Kilgore was riding her horse along the NRE River, and she had a 1-year-old infant child with her. And she never made it home that night. And so they sent out a search party looking for him, and they found her laying on the banks of the NRE. She had been scalped. And they found her 1-year-old son, Joseph Kilgore, laying beside her. He had been scalped, and he lived. He lived for about another 50 or 60 years, moved in Greenville. We got plantation subdivisions named after James Kilgore. He was a state senator for 16 years from Greenville County. This is the kind of things that were happening in, the colonial backcountry where we are right now. So, as far as how the Cherokee War and the relations with the Cherokees ended, what happened was the Cherokees had been told for a long time, until you adopt European customs, until you adopt our values, our laws, there will never be peace between us. Well, the Cherokees did that. Starting about 1800, they welcomed Moravian missionaries into their territory. The Moravians, they had church on Sunday. Usually the Moravian wife was a school mistress, and she would teach classes. The Cherokees developed an alphabet. They developed a newspaper. They developed a bicameral system of a legislative system. They had sheriffs. They did everything that they were asked to do to become just like the European Americans. And that was from about 1800 to about 1835 or so. About 1828, the worst thing possible could have happened to the Cherokees. And that was when gold was discovered on their land. And the Georgia settlers would have none of them not be able to go get that land. And the Cherokees appealed to Andrew Jackson, who was their ally, who they fought with in 1816 in the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in Alabama. The Cherokees were instrumental in Andrew Jackson winning that battle. They were his friends. They were his allies. They went to Washington to talk to Andrew Jackson to see if he would rescind the order to move them to Oklahoma. And Andrew Jackson turned his back on them. So 16,000 Cherokees were marched on the Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. 4,000 of them died. So relations with the Cherokees started wrong. Relations with the Cherokees ended wrong. And in between, there was this horrible misunderstandings and murders and massacres and retributions between each other. And anytime anything happened in the backcountry, the Cherokees got blamed for it, whether it was Creeks from Georgia, Catawbas, Europeans dressed up as Cherokees. All of that happened, and the Cherokees got blamed for everything. So, tensions were, at a breaking point with the Cherokees and the settlers, and it had to do with the Cherokees, support of the British Crown. And one fellow who was an Indian trader was a great uncle of Wade Hampton, who was a Confederate general and future governor. This is one of his great uncles, was named Preston Hampton. And Preston Hampton, one account says he was not treating the Cherokees right in his trade practices. Another account says he was a peacemaker with the Cherokees and so forth, but if he wanted to keep trading and cheating them, he was going to want to make peace. And so anyway, what was happening was Preston Hampton was at his father's house, and this is Anthony Hampton, who was the great-grandfather of Wade Hampton. And Anthony Hampton saw a leading man of the Cherokees on the woods line who he knew, so he went out to greet him. And Preston Hampton was by his side. And as Anthony Hampton was shaking the leading man's hand, a shot rang out. And Preston Hampton was killed immediately. And as the chief or the leading man was shaking Hampton's with one hand, he was taking the other and hitting him in the head with a tomahawk. And those two men were killed at that point. Now, there were the other women and children there at the Hampton place as well. One was a little baby who was less than a year old. He was killed. There was an orphan boy who was there who was about 8 years old. He was kidnapped. Others were killed. So then that group of Cherokees went to the home of Preston Hampton. And Preston Hampton's wife was in the woods. Her two children, 7 and 8 years old, were at home. And she saw the Cherokees murder her two children. And they say she never spoke again for the rest of her life. During this same time, actually I've got pictures of this. This is the monument to Anthony Hampton, and the people were killed in the Hampton Massacre. This monument sits on Poinsett Highway, or Highway 29, not Poinsett Highway, Highway 29 going to Greer. And it's just across the Greenville-Spartanburg line. Anthony Hampton lived right on the line between Spartanburg, at that time was Spartan District, and Greenville County was Indian Territory. So that's right before you get to the Vern Smith Parkway, for those of y'all who are familiar with that area. At the same time, some people say the same day, Jacob Hitt was murdered. He was attacked. He was gruesomely tortured. I can't describe it. His two daughters were kidnapped and they were never seen again. And his wife was kidnapped. And I will tell you a story about his wife being recovered. Roy, I think you gave me a sheaf of papers called the Ross pamphlet. And this is in those papers where Mrs. Ross, her nephew, was with the party that found the body of Mrs. Hitt. And when she was killed, you know, her dress was taken from her. Clothes were valuable. I mean, if you robbed somebody on the highway, you took their clothes as well as everything else. So her naked body was laying on the ground. And her nephew knew that it was there. So what he did was he took a blanket and held it like this and walked backwards till he got to the body and covered it out of a sign of respect. And that's how her body was recovered. But, you know, the Cherokees were on the warpath as a result of the Hampton massacre and other events that happened then. Now, I do have a description in Jerry Alexander's book of what was happening during that time. And this is written by a fellow named Matthew Brown, who was in his early 20s, and he was stationed at Kellett's Blockhouse. Kellett's Blockhouse, 20 miles from here, on Fairview Road. It's in Greenville County now. At the time, it was in Laurens County, or the Little River District. But the Kellett Blockhouse, there were blockhouses set up all along the Cherokee border, about every 10 or 20 miles. And one of the blockhouses was Kellett's Blockhouse. Another blockhouse, a sister fort, was Fort Lindley, which Roy discovered. So in 1832, Matthew Brown wrote this account because this is one of our sources for information, was the pension applications that these militiamen were filling out 50 years after the fact. But 50 years later, the government realized that these fellows were getting old and they couldn't keep themselves up and everything, so they were giving them pensions. As long as you filled out that application saying what you did, and it had to be notarized and witnessed and all that sort of thing. But we got a lot of information from these pension applications, you know, tens of thousands of accounts even though the recollection is a little bit fuzzy 50 years later, especially for a 75-year-old. But this is what Matthew Brown wrote in 1832. The Indians and Tories made attacks on the frontier and killed and scalped 30-odd persons. In a few days after, our company repaired to the place and buried the dead. Now this is Matthew Brown's job, is burying dead and scalped settlers. And he's only doing it in a 10 or 15 mile radius from Kellett's blockhouse. Because if they were dead somewhere else, that other blockhouse would bury them. There was a total of 61 settlers killed during this time. 31 of them were buried by Matthew Brown. 2 or 3 weeks after, we were about 30 miles in Indian country from Lindley's fort. We met a Tory. I kind of feel sorry for that Tory. He informed us that the Indians and Tories, about 600 strong, were on their way to take Lindley's fort. I wonder what they had to do to get him to inform that. But anyway, we'll leave that for speculation. We repaired immediately to the fort as soon as possible to inform them of the danger and assist in defense of the place. We arrived at the fort the same evening. This is the Little River Regiment he's talking about. This is your ancestors. We found many of the troops intoxicated and not expecting an attack. One Louis Duval attempted to shoot Lieutenant McDavid for bringing him such words. The commander, Major Jonathan Downs, the hero of Lawrence County, ordered the rum be stopped and the companies that were around the fort to come in. At this moment, Colonel Beard arrived with 300 troops on their way from a place called the Dutch Forks to join the expedition against the Indians, commanded by General Williamson. About midnight, the Indians and Tories surrounded the fort. The alarm was given by the sentry, and the men fired out of the fort and shot down 2 Tories at the front door. We found plenty of blood, but no Indians found. We got about 10 stands of Indian colors. Our men made a sally from the fort, and the Indians and the Tories retreated in great haste. In the morning, we pursued the enemy. Our lines were about a half mile wide. We took 8 or 10 of the enemy prisoners. They were painted like Indians, but were Tories. We followed the trail about 3 miles to a small field and found about 30 horses, saddles, saddlebags, and blankets. Among them, we found Colonel Lindley's saddle and saddlebags, and in his saddlebags, we found his commission. And about an acre of ground was all scattered over with bags of parched cornmeal. The next day, our company of scouts took 8 or 10 Tories at their homes, still painted as Indians. So half of that attacking party was Cherokee, and the other half was Tories painted like Cherokees. They were referred to as Scophilites. Now, you may have noticed that we're talking about Lindley's fort that was attacked, and we're talking about the next morning, the Patriots are finding saddlebags with Captain James Lindley's papers in the saddlebags. Captain Lindley is attacking his own fort, okay? James Lindley was a justice of the peace in the colonial government. And for any loyalist who did not sign an oath giving allegiance to the Council of Safety in Charleston, the Patriot cause, if they did not sign an oath, half of their property was immediately confiscated. And if they particularly complained about that, all their property was confiscated. So James Lindley's property was taken. And Major Jonathan Downs, who was the colonel or major of the Little River Regiment, he moved in. Now his place was only a few miles from James Lindley, but James Lindley's house, which was a fort during the first Cherokee Indian War. Lindley's fort was started in about 1760. Then it lay dormant for 15 years, but when the Revolutionary War started up again, it was refortified. And it was refortified by Jonathan Downs and the Little River Regiment, and that in effect was their headquarters. So James Lindley is attacking his house with Tories and Cherokees. This is the field around Lindley's fort. The fort is just in that tree line there. And this is what we're going to see on Saturday. I hope that as many of you as possible can join us on Saturday. It is a little bit of a rough walk. It's going to be 400 or 500 yards. You're going to need boots and blue jeans because we're walking through these woods right here, and it may be a little damp. But I sure hope you're able to come because there's a lot there. This is one of the very few Revolutionary War locations where we know exactly where it was. Because so many of these spots, we've just got a little semblance of an idea. But at Fort Lindley, the defensive trenches all around that fort are still visible. Now, during the Revolutionary War, they were probably 10 feet wide and 6 feet deep. And the dirt that came out of that trench was thrown up as a berm, and on top of that was a parapet of palisaded logs all the way around. And those logs would have been about 8 feet tall. So you would have had to go down that ditch, up the berm, through the palisades, all the time you're being shot at. So Fort Lindley did not fall. It defended itself after a 2-hour brisk gunfight. That's what another eyewitness says. That sally out of the fort, 10 abreast, broke the attack, and the Cherokees retreated. But we're going to see this on Saturday. This is a number one, very important Lawrence County site, and I hope that y'all can join me on that. That's the field where the Little River Regiment was laid out drunk. So this is a lovely picture of Lake Hartwell. And this picture is taken from the site where Fort Rutledge is. At the bottom of that lake right there was the Cherokee town of Seneca. Seneca was the closest Cherokee town to European settlement, and therefore it was a scene of a fair amount of activity because it was the first interface with the European Americans. Andrew Williamson, who was he was colonel at this time, he was later general, but Colonel Andrew Williamson gathered a force of 2,000 men to go into Cherokee territory to chastise the Cherokees because of what had happened when they were on the warpath with the 61 settlers being killed. July 15th, 1776, the Cherokees and Tories attacked Fort Lindley right here. August the 1st, 1776, William sets out an expedition. He gathers 2,000 men to go through Cherokee territory. And he had word that Alexander Cameron is in Seneca, which was the Cherokee name of the town on the Seneca River. Now, to describe Seneca, and it was like all the other Cherokee towns, but we have an excellent description of Seneca written by William Bartram in 1775. William Bartram was a Philadelphia botanist and horticulturalist. And he and his father toured the southern states in 1767. 1775, William Bartram comes back through, repeating that journey, continuing to look for botanical specimens. And he is, you know, one of the giants in botany, in American botany. And he had such a command of the English language. It's worthwhile reading William Bartram's books because he just puts you right there. But he describes the town of Seneca. And he says that there were 100 huts or houses on the far side of the river from where this picture is taken. It would be on the south side. And on the north side was where the council house was, in an elevated spot on the north side. All of this is under that water. He describes 4 miles of planted corn and vegetable fields, 4 miles long, the bottomland along the Seneca River. And the Cherokees and the Native Americans were superb agriculturalists. And I would love to give an hour-long lecture on the agricultural processes of the Native Americans. We think that, you know, the Europeans were good farmers and so forth. They couldn't hold a candle to what these Cherokees did. They taught the Europeans how to grow crops in America. And these Cherokees were doing this with Stone Age tools. They had no metal. They had no beast of burden. But they had agricultural fields 4 miles long. Along the woods line, they had draped muscadine vines, so that when the muscadines were in season, there they were. They just went and they had wild plums. They would just go get them. They were definitely in tune with nature, no doubt about that. So this was, they were growing corn, beans, squash, pumpkins, and watermelons, and tobacco. And they were very good at that. So Williamson gets word that Cameron is in Seneca. And he sends his column, he sends a party to Seneca at night because they wanted to surprise Cameron. Well, Cameron knew they were coming. And so he set up an ambush. And right as they got to Seneca, behind a fence that the Cherokees had made, they were stationed, and they let loose with musket fire at that time. Now, I told you about Major Danger Thompson. He led the attack of the Great Canebrake. He goes down to Sullivans Island, holds off the British at Breach Inlet. That's on June 28th. By August the 1st, he's up here, and he's with Williamson, riding at the head of the column. And right beside Danger Thompson is Francis Salvador. Francis Salvador came to America in 1772, but he was immediately popular. He is the first person of Jewish faith to be elected to any office in America. And that was in 1774, and that was right here in South Carolina. Francis Salvador lived near Greenwood. Y'all know where Coronacca is? Well, that was Francis Salvador's plantation, was Coronacca. And Coronacca means corn acre. But Salvador was riding with Danger Thompson. The Cherokees let loose with a volley. Francis Salvador is shot 3 times. And, you know, he falls off his horse. It's a confusing battle. Leroy Hammond is in the back. Andrew Pickens is in the back. Both of those men were experienced Indian fighters. And what they knew was when you charged the Cherokees, they dispersed. This is what happened at Fort Lindley. This was their method of fighting. They did not stick around. They did not want to give up their life or their country. They were too smart for that. if you attacked them, they fled. And there was no dishonor in that. This is just different philosophies. They wanted to get that initial hit, and they were pleased when they did that because their enemy never knew when that hit was coming. So Andrew Pickens and Leroy Hammond and their men charged the Cherokees, and they broke the attack and they fled. Well, in the meantime, the troopers saw a figure leaning over Francis Salvador, and they figured that it was his manservant, it was his slave. So most, if not all, of these leading men had a manservant that fought side by side with them. Well, the next morning they realized that that was not the manservant of Francis Salvador, leaning over and tending to his wounded owner. It was a Cherokee who was in the process of scalping Francis Salvador. And he did scalp him, he scalped him alive, and Francis Salvador lived till the next morning. And Francis Salvador was the first Jewish American to die in the name of liberty in the American Revolution. And that happened right there at the bottom of that lake. And we're going there next month. We'll be going to Fort Rutledge and we'll be seeing this spot. So that was on August the 1st. On August the 15th, Williamson and his command are moving through Cherokee territory. And as they move through, they are burning every house they come to. They are destroying every cornfield they come to. They are killing all the animals. It is annihilation. It's complete destruction. It is chastising the Cherokees. The Cherokees were defeated to such extent that they spent the following winter with just the clothes on their back, no food, no shelter, in the mountains of North Carolina and Tennessee. They were destitute as a result. There are no heroes in the Cherokee War of 1776. No heroes. No heroes on the Cherokee side, no heroes on the Patriot side. It was complete annihilation. The Cherokee War of 1776 was the greatest massacre in the Revolutionary War. I have no records of any prisoners. Now, until I read Nadia Dean's book, I had no idea that there were any prisoners. But she does report several letters of after-action accounts, 6 Cherokees were killed, we had 15 prisoners, and that sort of thing. I don't know what happened to those prisoners, whether they were sent to the mountains with everybody else, or if they were just killed outright. It was one or the other. So, that was what was going on in the Cherokee War. But as Andrew Pickens and Robert Anderson were progressing through the Cherokee territory, they came to the Cherokee town of Tomasee. And Tomasee, the Cheowee Creek runs right through this tree line here. And this is where Tomasee was. This is one of the prettiest places in South Carolina. And we're going here too. I want y'all to join me. We're going to see Tomasee. It's breathtaking. This is Tomasee Knob in the background. So Andrew Pickens and Robert Anderson, Anderson County, Anderson City is named after Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson was Andrew Pickens' second in command throughout life. They were childhood friends in Virginia, and we'll talk more about that. But Robert Anderson took 35 men and went one way. And Andrew Pickens took 25 men and he went another way. And as they were in Tomasee, burning the houses, perhaps here, if not here, close by to here, but as they were in this area, all of a sudden, they see a brave jump up. This was an old abandoned agricultural field, and the grass was about 3 feet high. So they saw a brave jump up and start running. And Andrew Pickens says to his 25 men, "Hey guys, we got to go get him." So they chased him out into the middle of this field. And as soon as they did, 185 Cherokees rose up from the surrounding tall grass. So they were totally surrounded by these 185 Cherokees. And Andrew Pickens, he arranged his men in a double ring with 12 men on the inside and 13 men on the outside. And forevermore, this battle has been known as the ring fight. And of the many battles that Andrew Pickens was in, and I'm telling you folks, Andrew Pickens was one heck of a fighting man. And he was in the thick of many battles. He said the ring fight was his most serious one, his most intense fight. He lined his men up so the interior line would be firing while the exterior line was loading. And then as the exterior line was firing, the interior line was loading. And that's how he held off those 185 warriors. 3 times the ring was breached. And it was hand-to-hand fighting with rifle butts and tomahawks and hatchets. So after an hour and 15 minutes of this, 75 minutes of this intensive fighting, none of Pickens' men were killed, even though several were wounded. The word came, the surrounding patriots could hear the fight going on. Robert Anderson rushed to the scene with his 35 men. At the same time, Andrew Pickens' brother Robert came to the scene. And at the same time, the Little River Regiment under Jonathan Downs came to the scene. So the reinforcements finally came after 75 minutes. But during that time, as Jonathan Downs, the hero of Lawrence County, was leading his troops, he had his hand in front of his body like this. And a shot rang out, and it went right through his hand. And it lodged in his abdomen. And he carried that bullet in his belly for the rest of his life. But at that time, that was the end of his fighting days. So he sat out the war for the rest of the time, except he had one serious incident with Bloody Bill Cunningham, which we'll talk about. But that was what happened at Tomasi, the ring fight. Again, you recognize Tomasi Knob. Andrew Pickens had a penchant for building his houses where he fought battles. He had 4 houses in South Carolina, the Waxhaws, Abbeville. He had a house, he built a house overlooking the Battle of the Seneca, where I showed you the picture of Lake Hartwell. That was Andrew Pickens' view for the lake filled in. He also, his last house was at Tomasi, and he built his house right here. And it was called the Red House because it was a log cabin 1.5 stories tall. He painted it red and had green shutters. And it's probably high class at that point, I don't know. But anyway, in July on a Saturday afternoon, Andrew Pickens was reading his mail underneath the cedar trees when he breathed his last breath. So this is the spot where Andrew Pickens died, and that marker is there commemorating that, even though the plaque that was put on the marker is long gone. Somebody stole that. So the Andrew Williamson and his group continued on through. They burned 16 towns in South Carolina. They continued on, and they started burning middle towns of the Cherokees. They burned 31 towns in all. And at the same time this was going on, Griffith Rutherford from North Carolina was coming through. They actually met somewhere up around Tennessee and North Carolina. And there was also militia from Virginia attacking the Overhill Cherokees at the same time. So all this was going on with the Cherokee War of 1776, and then finally Williamson's men were marching through a pass north of Franklin, about 20, 30 miles north of Franklin, North Carolina. Nobody knows exactly where this happened. Don't know what county it happened in. But Williamson and his men were going through a steep pass, a steep valley, a pass, and they were ambushed from up above. And they lost about 20 men or so. And they couldn't attack the Cherokees because it was too steep. Williamson's men went as far as they could go until they got inland too steep to attack the Cherokees and break their attack. So they were sitting ducks right there. So that was as far as Williamson and his group went. They promptly declared victory and retreated back into South Carolina. And as a result of that war, state of South Carolina got Greenville, Anderson, Pickens, and Oconee counties. So I think I've run over my time a little bit. This is Fort Rutledge, a monument that was created by the DAR in 1909. And I've been doing work at Fort Rutledge. We cleaned out the foreground there of heavy, heavy underbrush. That's an example of what Fort Rutledge looked like when we first started. So we have cleared it out as much as we can. And Clemson, this summer, the Clemson archaeology students did a dig there, and they confirmed that this is the site of Fort Rutledge. And again, I can't wait to show y'all. There's so much that happened at Fort Rutledge. But at this time, I do think I'm going to wind things down. Like I say, I think I may have run over a little bit. But I would like to see if anybody had any questions. Yes?
How many years did that war take?
Right, good question. The first Cherokee War took 4 years until the Patriots realized what techniques they had to use. The second Cherokee War, the War of 1776, took 3 months. All of that happened in 3 months. Yes?
Yes, sir. How was the Cherokee territory defined? Was it by rivers or ridges?
That's a good question. How was Cherokee territory defined? And this is one of the things that led to the major conflicts. It wasn't defined. You know, it was crazy. So I talked about the Treaty of Saluda in 1776 and 1755, where these counties were allocated to the British government. The only defined border at that time was a little small corner where the Broad River was. One thing that really added to our problems was the fact that there were no survey points. There were no survey points whatsoever. So when the First Cherokee War ended in 1763, there was the Treaty of Charlestown that was created. And at that point, you see here where DeWitt's Corner is? Now, if you say DeWitt's Corner, DeWitt's, soon enough you get to due west. So DeWitt's Corner is due west, and that was the westernmost. It's not due west of anything. But anyway, okay, I got you. So that was defined. We knew where DeWitt's Corner was, and in the Treaty of Charlestown, 1763. The agreement was that the Cherokee territory would extend from a point here southwest to the Savannah River and northeast to the Reedy River. Now this line That's the border between Greenville and Lawrence counties. It's still in existence to this day. And this line here is the border between Abbeville and Anderson counties. So that line was established. But none of this line in here wasn't established. 1766, the governor of North Carolina, William Tryon, who was a devil, he decides that he's going to draw a line from where this line ended on the Reedy River due north. That's Lord Tryon's line, and he claimed this area for North Carolina. Well, there was a legal dispute over that. There was a court case over that in London. And it took 6 years to decide that fate. And at that time, the people in London said, no, Governor Tryon, you can't have that property. That's South Carolina. And South Carolina was given this area up here, which was called the New Acquisition, and it's York County. So, I mean, that's how that area was defined. But there was such poor definition of where these lines were. You know, I told you about Andrew Willis's place on Hard Labor Creek in Greenwood County. Well, in 1768, there was the Treaty of Hard Labor. Now, I don't think Andrew Williams had anything to do with this. I don't know who arranged that. But the Treaty of Hard Labor with the Cherokees is where the Cherokees gave up land that they supposedly had in West Virginia. The Cherokees were not in West Virginia, but they had a treaty granting that land to settlers who wanted to settle there. And the Cherokees got paid for that. They got trinkets and stuff like that. It's so confusing. At the same time that the Treaty of Hard Labor was going on, there was another treaty going on in Ohio with the Shawnees, who did live in West Virginia, called the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, which established the boundary of Cherokee territory at that time. But it was different from what the Treaty of Hard Labor said. And these treaties only lasted 6 months before they were violated. And in 1670, there was a treaty at Lochaber, Alexander Cameron's plantation, in Abbeville County, just right down the road. Treaty of Lochaber straightened out the Treaty of Hard Labor and the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. I mean, that was one of the major conflicts, was that these borders were not defined. So, interesting stuff. Figuring out the property lines, the state line, there's a lot of history in just where these different lines are. Well, if nobody else has got any questions, I appreciate your attentiveness and hope to see everybody at Fort Lindley. Oh, okay, here's the directions to Fort Lindley. Well, they're on my Facebook page. If you're on Facebook, I'm there. But it's 200 Macassa Trail. You may want to write that down. 200 M-A-C-A-S-A. Hard to remember. She's writing it down for you. 200 Macassa Trail. Boots and blue jeans.